Before I get into the story, can you say hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from? It means more than you know. My stepbrother handed me a pen and told me to sign. I said no. 3 days later, my dad threw me out of the house I had paid for. What they didn't know was that I had already made one phone call, and that phone call was about to unravel everything they thought they owned. My name is Ethan. I'm 32 years old. I'm a licensed electrician, and for most of my adult life, I believed that working hard and keeping your head down was enough to protect you from the people who were supposed to love you. I was wrong. It took losing almost everything to understand that silence isn't loyalty. It's just a slower way of being destroyed. My dad remarried when I was 19. My mother had passed away 2 years before that, a car accident on a Tuesday morning, on a road she had driven 1,000 times. There was no warning. There was no goodbye. One day she was there, and the next day she wasn't, and I spent the 2 years after that trying to hold my dad together while also falling apart myself. I cooked dinner. I paid the utilities for my part-time job while I finished my electrician's apprenticeship. I sat with him on the back porch when he couldn't sleep and didn't say anything. Just stayed nearby because that was all either of us had to offer. Then he met her. My stepmother came into our lives through a friend of a friend, and within 8 months, she was living in the house my mother had picked out, sleeping in the room my mother had painted herself, drinking coffee from the mug my mother had bought at a little shop in Vermont on the only vacation our family ever took together. I didn't say anything. I told myself grief had no right to be possessive. I told myself my dad deserved to be happy. She had a son. My stepbrother was 24 when they got married, a year younger than me, and from the first month he moved in, I understood exactly how things were going to be arranged. He didn't work steady. He picked up shifts here and there, quit when something bothered him, and whenever money got tight, he had a way of making my dad feel responsible for fixing it. My dad, who had always been the kind of man who equated providing with loving, responded every time. A loan to cover rent. A loan for a car. A loan that was never called a loan because calling it that would have made everyone uncomfortable. I stayed out of it. I had my own place by then, a one-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away. But I came over most Sundays for dinner. I helped with repairs around the house, and I kept paying the property tax installments on the house, because my dad had asked me to years earlier when his cash flow was uneven and I had just gotten my journeyman's license. It was a practical arrangement. The house was in both our names, mine and my dad's, because my mother had insisted on it before she died, said she wanted to make sure I had something solid no matter what happened. I had been paying my half of those tax bills for 6 years without missing once. My stepbrother knew about the property arrangement. I don't know exactly when my dad told him, but at some point he knew, because things shifted in a way that is only visible in retrospect. My stepmother started asking small questions at dinner. Was I planning to sell eventually? Did I ever think about liquidating and buying something of my own? Had my dad and I ever talked about what would happen to the house long term? I answered carefully and didn't think too much about it. The pen moment happened on a Thursday evening in February. I had come over to help my dad with a panel upgrade in the garage. He had bought a new workshop setup and needed the amperage for it. And when I walked in, my stepbrother was already sitting at the kitchen table with a folder in front of him. My stepmother was making tea with her back to me. My dad was standing near the counter with the look on his face that I had come to recognize over the years, the one that meant he had already agreed to something and was hoping I would make it easy. My stepbrother opened the folder and pushed it across the table toward me. It was a loan agreement, a personal loan, $46,000, from a credit union I had never heard of. His name was listed as borrower. My name was listed as cosigner. I didn't sit down. I read the first page standing up, then I set it back on the table and looked at my dad. My dad said my stepbrother was trying to start a business, a landscaping operation. He had a plan, equipment lined up, a guy who would give him a contract for commercial properties. He just needed the credit boost. My score was excellent. It would barely affect me. He would pay it back within 2 years. I asked my stepbrother directly if he had a business license. He said he was working on it. I asked if he had the commercial contract in writing. He said it was a handshake deal. I asked what equipment he had lined up, and he said he was still pricing it out. I put the folder back in the center of the table and I told them no. What happened next happened fast. My stepbrother's voice went up immediately, and he said I had never supported him, had never treated him like real family, had always looked down on him. My stepmother turned around from the counter and said I was selfish and that family members help each other when it matters. My dad said nothing for a moment, and then he said he thought I could at least think about it. I said there was nothing to think about it. I was not co-signing a loan for a business that didn't exist yet, with no paperwork, no license, and no contract. That was the end of it for me. My stepbrother stood up and pointed at me and said the words I still remember exactly. "You act like you own this family." I told him I didn't, but I did own half the house we were standing in, and I would like to be treated with basic respect inside it. My stepmother told my dad that I just threatened them. I left. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel and I told myself it would blow over. It had blown over before. This was just another version of the same argument we had been having for years, just louder this time. 4 days later, my dad called me and told me that he and my stepmother had decided it would be better if I didn't come to Sunday dinners for a while. He said things were tense and they needed space. I asked how long. He said he didn't know. I said, okay. I didn't argue. I hung up and sat on my couch in the quiet of my apartment and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not quite hurt, not quite anger. Something that had no name but had weight. For the next 6 weeks, I heard nothing. I sent my dad a text on his birthday. He replied with a thank you and nothing else. I called once, on a Sunday afternoon, and my stepmother answered and told me he was busy and would call me back. He didn't call back. Then the certified letter arrived. It came on a Wednesday. Return address was an attorney's office I didn't recognize. I opened it at my kitchen table with my coffee going cold beside me. The letter informed me that my father and his spouse had initiated a partition action regarding the jointly held property. For anyone who hasn't encountered that term, a partition action is a legal process where one co-owner of a property asks a court to force a sale or division when the co-owners cannot agree. The letter stated that my father wished to sell the property and that I had 30 days to respond. I read it 3 times. Then I put it down and looked at the wall for a while. The house my mother had picked out. The house she had painted, room by room, over 2 summers. The house where I had grown up, where she had grown old enough to leave behind. Where my dad and I had kept each other company in the terrible silence after she was gone. They were trying to take it. I called an attorney that afternoon, not a friend of a friend, not someone cheap. I called the best real estate attorney in my county, a woman whose name had come up twice in professional circles as someone you wanted on your side in a property dispute. I explained the situation. She asked me several questions, including one I wasn't expecting. Had I been paying the property taxes consistently, and was I current? I told her I had been paying my share every installment for 6 years without missing once. She said that was good. She asked me to bring every document I had, the original deed, every tax payment record, any written communication with my dad about the property arrangement. I brought everything. The attorney reviewed the partition filing and told me 2 things. First, my position was strong. I was a co-owner of record with a consistent payment history and a legitimate interest in the property. A court would not simply hand a forced sale to my father's side without a fight. Second, and this was the part that made me go still in my chair. The partition filing included an affidavit signed by my father claiming that I had verbally agreed to relinquish my ownership interest in exchange for a lump sum payment that had allegedly already been made to me. There was no lump sum. There was no agreement. There was no payment. The affidavit had been notarized. I told my attorney that was a lie. Every word of it. She looked at me carefully and asked if I had any documentation showing I had received no such payment. Bank records. Anything. I told her my bank records would show no deposit of any meaningful amount from my father in the last 5 years. I told her the only financial transfers between us were the Zelle payments he occasionally sent when I covered a bill for him. Never more than a few $100s. She said we would need those records. She also said she wanted to look at that affidavit very carefully. Here is what she found. The affidavit was dated 8 months earlier, 3 months before I had even been asked to co-sign the loan. The date on the document placed the signing on a Sunday afternoon in April. My attorney's paralegal pulled the notary's public registry, which notaries are required to maintain by law, logging every document they notarize with a date, and the identification presented by signatories. My name appeared in that registry for the April date, but I had not signed anything that April. I had not met with any notary. I had not agreed to anything. My attorney filed a subpoena for the notary's full journal for that date. What came back was revealing. The notary's journal entry for that Sunday was missing entirely, not blank, missing, as in the page had been removed and replaced. A forensic document examiner, whom my attorney brought in at my cost, confirmed that the replacement page had been inserted after the fact. The paper stock didn't match. The ink age didn't match. And then the detail that closed everything. The notary whose stamp appeared on my father's affidavit had published a notice in the local county record 3 months after the supposed signing date, reporting his stamp lost or stolen, a routine legal procedure notaries use to protect themselves from liability when their official seal goes missing. His stamp had been reported missing. The stamp on my father's affidavit had been applied after the date it was reported gone. Someone had used the stolen notary stamp to fabricate a legal document claiming I had signed away my ownership of my childhood home. My attorney filed a motion to dismiss the partition action and simultaneously filed a complaint with the county district attorney's office for document fraud. She also filed a request for emergency injunctive relief to prevent any sale of the property while the matter was under review. The motion was granted within 9 days. I remember the afternoon I got that call. I was on a job site, running conduit through a commercial kitchen retrofit, and my phone buzzed in my chest pocket. My attorney's voice was calm and professional, and she said the motion had been granted, the sale was frozen pending investigation, and that the district attorney's office had confirmed they were opening an inquiry into the affidavit. I thanked her. I hung up. I stood in the middle of that half-finished kitchen for a moment, with the smell of new drywall and cut wire around me, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't realized I had been holding. That evening, I drove past the house. I didn't stop. I just slowed down and looked at it from the street. The front porch my mother had strung lights along every December. The oak tree in the side yard she had planted from a sapling the year they moved in. The window of the room that had been mine for 18 years. That looked the same as it always had. Houses don't know what's happening inside them. The DA's investigation took 4 months. I cooperated fully and gave a recorded statement. My bank records were subpoenaed. Every Zelle transfer, every payment, 6 years of tax installments. All of it laid out in front of investigators who did not look particularly surprised by what they were seeing. My stepbrother was interviewed twice. My stepmother was interviewed once. My dad was interviewed 3 times. What came out during those interviews, relayed to me later by my attorney, from documents that became part of the public record, was this. My stepbrother had located the notary through a mutual contact, someone who owed him a favor. The notary had allowed his stamp to be used on the fabricated affidavit, after which, whether from guilt or self-protection, he had reported the stamp stolen to create plausible distance from what he had done. My stepmother had drafted the language of the affidavit herself, based on legal templates she had found online. My dad had signed the filing as a party to the partition action without, according to his own statement to investigators, fully understanding what the affidavit claimed. I don't know how much of that last part is true. I don't know how much my father understood and how much he chose not to look at. That is a question I have sat with and have not yet fully answered. My stepbrother was charged with 1 count of forgery and 1 count of filing a fraudulent legal document. He accepted a plea agreement, 18 months of supervised probation, community service, and restitution to cover a portion of my legal fees. My stepmother was not charged, but was named in the civil complaint I filed separately. That matter settled before trial. The terms are confidential, but my legal fees were covered, and then some. My father called me the night after the DA closed the criminal phase of the investigation. It was late, almost 11, and I almost didn't answer. When I picked up, his voice was quieter than I had heard it in years. Not the careful quiet of someone managing a situation, but the genuine quiet of someone who had run out of ways to manage anything. He said he was sorry. He said he had let things go further than he should have. He said he had told himself he was keeping the peace, and had not looked hard enough at what keeping the peace was costing. I listened. I didn't fill the silence when he stopped talking. After a while, I told him I heard him. I told him I didn't know yet what came next for us. I told him I needed time, and he said he understood. We are not estranged. We are not what we were. We have had 5 or 6 dinners since then, just the 2 of us at a diner not far from his house, and we talk carefully, the way you talk when you're still figuring out how much weight a thing can hold. My stepmother still lives in the house. My stepbrother finished his probation and moved to another state. I don't know where exactly, and I don't ask. I still own half the house. The partition action was dismissed with prejudice, which means it cannot be refiled on the same grounds. My name is still on the deed my mother put it on, and my tax payments are still on record going back to the year I started making them. Some people ask me if I hate them. I don't have a clean answer to that. There are moments when something that might be anger moves through me. Usually late at night when I think about the version of events where I missed something, where I didn't have records, where the motion didn't go through in time. Those moments pass. What I carry more consistently is something like clarity. I spent years trying to be low maintenance, low conflict, the son who didn't make things harder. I paid bills on time. I showed up on Sundays. I kept my opinions about my stepmother and stepbrother mostly to myself because I thought that was what a good son did. What I understand now is that none of that protected me. What protected me was my mother's foresight in putting my name on a deed, and my own habit of keeping records, and the decision I made in a kitchen in February to put a folder back on a table and say no. The pen was in my hand for a moment. I remember that. My stepbrother slid it across the table and I picked it up automatically, the way you do when someone hands you something, and I held it for just a second before I set it back down. That second is the thing I think about most. If you've ever been handed a pen and told to sign something that didn't feel right, and you signed it anyway because the room was tense and it was easier and you didn't want to be the difficult one. I understand that. I almost did it. I have been in rooms where it would have been simpler to agree, and I know what that pressure feels like when it's coming from people you grew up trusting. But here's what I've learned. The moment you sign something that isn't true, you don't just lose whatever the document is about. You lose your standing. You lose your ability to say, clearly and on record, that you didn't agree. You hand them the story. Don't hand them the story. The oak tree my mother planted is probably 40 feet tall now. I drove past the house last spring on a Sunday morning and the light was coming through the branches in that particular way. It does in April, low and gold. And I sat at the curb for a moment and just looked at it. I thought about her. I thought about all the mornings she must have stood at the kitchen window and looked at that same tree when it was still small enough that she could see over it. I don't know what the future of that house looks like. I don't know if my dad and I will ever get back to something that feels like before, or whether before is even a place worth going back to. What I know is that my name is still on it. What I know is that I didn't sign, and some mornings that is enough. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you've ever been in a situation where family asked you to sign away something that was yours, I'd like to hear about it in the comments. You are not alone, and I read every single one.